Chapter 2 Shikata ga nai. In December of 1941, Papa's disappearance didn't bother me nearly so much as the world I soon found myself in. He had been a jack of all trades. When I was born, he was farming near Inglewood. Later, when he started fishing, we moved to Ocean Park, near Santa Monica, and until they picked him up, that's where we lived, in a big frame house with a brick fireplace, a block back from the beach. We were the only Japanese family in the neighborhood. Papa liked it that way. He didn't want to be labeled or grouped by anyone. But with him gone and no way of knowing what to expect, my mother moved all of us down to Terminal Island. Woody already lived there, and one of my older sisters had married a Terminal Island boy. Mama's first concern now was to keep the family together. And once the war began, she felt safer there than isolated racially in Ocean Park. But for me, at age 7, the island was a country as foreign as India or Arabia would have been. It was the first time I had lived among other Japanese or gone to school with them, and I was terrified all the time. This was partly Papa's fault. One of his threats to keep us younger kids in line was, "I'm going to sell you to the Chinaman." When I had entered kindergarten 2 years earlier, I was the only Asian in the class. They sat me next to a Caucasian girl who happened to have very slanted eyes. I looked at her and began to scream, certain Papa had sold me out at last. My fear of her ran so deep I could not speak of it, even to Mama. Couldn't explain why I was screaming. For 2 weeks I had nightmares about this girl, until the teachers finally moved me to the other side of the room. And it was still with me, this fear of Asian faces, when we moved to Terminal Island. In those days it was a company town, a ghetto owned and controlled by the canneries. The men went after fish, and whenever the boats came back, day or night, the women would be called to process the catch while it was fresh. 1 in the afternoon or 4 in the morning, it made no difference. My mother had to go to work right after we moved there. I can still hear the whistle. 2 toots for French's, 3 for Van Camp's, and she and Chizu would be out of bed in the middle of the night, heading for the cannery. The house we lived in was nothing more than a shack, a barracks with single plank walls and rough wooden floors, like the cheapest kind of migrant workers' housing. The people around us were hard-working, boisterous, a little proud of their nickname, Yogore, which meant literally uncouth one, or roughneck, or dead-end kid. They not only spoke Japanese exclusively, they spoke a dialect peculiar to Kyushu, where their families had come from in Japan, a rough fisherman's language full of oaths and insults. Instead of saying, "bakatare," a common insult meaning stupid, Terminal Islanders would say, "bakayaro," a coarser and exclusively masculine use of the word, which implies gross stupidity. They would swagger and pick on outsiders and persecute anyone who didn't speak as they did. That was what made my own time there so hateful. I had never spoken anything but English, and the other kids in the 2nd grade despised me for it. They were tough and mean, like ghetto kids anywhere. Each day after school, I dreaded their ambush. My brother Kyo, 3 years older, would wait for me at the door, where we would decide whether to run straight home together or split up, or try a new and unexpected route. None of these kids ever actually attacked. It was the threat that frightened us, their fearful looks and the noises they would make like miniature samurai in a language we couldn't understand. At the time, it seemed we had been living under this reign of fear for years. In fact, we lived there about 2 months. Late in February, the Navy decided to clear Terminal Island completely. Even though most of us were American-born, it was dangerous having that many Asians so close to the Long Beach Naval Station on the opposite end of the island. We had known something like this was coming. But, like Papa's arrest, not much could be done ahead of time. There were 4 of us kids still young enough to be living with Mama, plus Granny, her mother, 65 then, speaking no English and nearly blind. Mama didn't know where else she could get work, and we had nowhere else to move to. On February 25th, the choice was made for us. We were given 48 hours to clear out. The second-hand dealers had been prowling around for weeks, like wolves, offering humiliating prices for goods and furniture they knew many of us would have to sell sooner or later. Mama had left all but her most valuable possessions in Ocean Park, simply because she had nowhere to put them. She had brought along her pottery, her silver, heirlooms like the kimonos Granny had brought from Japan, tea sets, lacquered tables, and one fine old set of china, blue and white porcelain, almost translucent. On the day we were leaving, Woody's car was so crammed with boxes and luggage and kids, we had just run out of room. Mama had to sell this china. One of the dealers offered her $15 for it. She said it was a full setting for 12 and worth at least $200. He said 15 was his top price. Mama started to quiver. Her eyes blazed up at him. She had been packing all night and trying to calm down Granny, who didn't understand why we were moving again and what all the rush was about. Mama's nerves were shot, and now Navy jeeps were patrolling the streets. She didn't say another word. She just glared at this man, all the rage and frustration channeled at him through her eyes. He watched her for a moment and said he was sure he couldn't pay more than $17.50 for that china. She reached into the red velvet case, took out a dinner plate, and hurled it at the floor right in front of his feet. The man leaped back, shouting, "Hey, don't do that! Those are valuable dishes!" Mama took out another dinner plate and hurled it at the floor, then another and another, never moving, never opening her mouth, just quivering and glaring at the retreating dealer with tears streaming down her cheeks. He finally turned and scuttled out the door, heading for the next house. When he was gone, she stood there smashing cups and bowls and platters until the whole set lay in scattered blue and white fragments across the wooden floor. The American Friends Service helped us find a small house in Boyle Heights, another minority ghetto in downtown Los Angeles, now inhabited briefly by a few hundred Terminal Island refugees. Executive Order 9066 had been signed by President Roosevelt, giving the War Department authority to define military areas in western states and to exclude from them anyone who might threaten the war effort. There was a lot of talk about internment or moving inland, or something like that in store for all Japanese Americans. I remember my brothers sitting around the table talking very intently about what we were going to do, how we would keep the family together. They had seen how quickly Papa was removed, and they knew now he would not be back for quite a while. Just before leaving Terminal Island, Mama had received her first letter from Bismarck, North Dakota. He had been imprisoned at Fort Lincoln, in an all-male camp for enemy aliens. Papa had been the patriarch. He had always decided everything in the family. With him gone, my brothers, like counselors in the absence of a chief, worried about what should be done. The ironic thing is, there wasn't much left to decide. These were mainly days of quiet, desperate waiting for what seemed at the time to be inevitable. There is a phrase the Japanese use in such situations when something difficult must be endured. You would hear the older heads, the issei, telling others very quietly, "Shikata ga nai." It cannot be helped. "Shikata ga nai." It must be done. Mama and Woody went to work packing celery for a Japanese produce dealer. Kyo and my sister May and I enrolled in the local school, and what sticks in my memory from those few weeks is the teacher, not her looks, her remoteness. In Ocean Park, my teacher had been a kind, grandmotherly woman who used to sail with us in Papa's boat from time to time, and who wept the day we had to leave. In Boyle Heights, the teacher felt cold and distant. I was confused by all the moving and was having trouble with the classwork, but she would never help me out. She would have nothing to do with me. This was the first time I had felt outright hostility from a Caucasian. Looking back, it is easy enough to explain. Public attitudes toward the Japanese in California were shifting rapidly. In the first few months of the Pacific War, America was on the run. Tolerance had turned to distrust and irrational fear. The 100-year-old tradition of anti-Asian sentiment on the West Coast soon resurfaced, more vicious than ever. Its result became clear about a month later, when we were told to make our third and final move. The name Manzanar meant nothing to us when we left Boyle Heights. We didn't know where it was or what it was. We went because the government ordered us to. And, in the case of my older brothers and sisters, we went with a certain amount of relief. They had all heard stories of Japanese homes being attacked, of beatings in the streets of California towns. They were as frightened of the Caucasians as Caucasians were of us. Moving, under what appeared to be government protection, to an area less directly threatened by the war seemed not such a bad idea at all. For some, it actually sounded like a fine adventure. Our pickup point was a Buddhist church in Los Angeles. It was very early and misty when we got there with our luggage. Mama had bought heavy coats for all of us. She grew up in eastern Washington and knew that anywhere inland in early April would be cold. I was proud of my new coat, and I remember sitting on a duffel bag trying to be friendly with the Greyhound driver. I smiled at him. He didn't smile back. He was befriending no one. Someone tied a numbered tag to my collar and to the duffel bag. Each family was given a number, and that became our official designation until the camps were closed. Someone else passed out box lunches for the trip, and we climbed aboard. I had never been outside Los Angeles County, never traveled more than 10 miles from the coast, had never even ridden on a bus. I was full of excitement, the way any kid would be, and wanted to look out the window. But for the first few hours, the shades were drawn. Around me, other people played cards, read magazines, dozed, waiting. I settled back, waiting too, and finally fell asleep. The bus felt very secure to me. Almost half its passengers were immediate relatives. Mama and my older brothers had succeeded in keeping most of us together on the same bus, headed for the same camp. I didn't realize until much later what a job that was. The strategy had been, first, to have everyone living in the same district when the evacuation began, and then to get all of us included under the same family number, even though names had been changed by marriage. Many families weren't as lucky as ours and suffered months of anguish while trying to arrange transfers from one camp to another. We rode all day. By the time we reached our destination, the shades were up. It was late afternoon. The first thing I saw was a yellow swirl across a blurred, reddish, setting sun. The bus was being pelted by what sounded like splattering rain. It wasn't rain. This was my first look at something I would soon know very well, a billowing flurry of dust and sand churned up by the wind through Owens Valley. We drove past a barbed wire fence, through a gate, and into an open space where trunks and sacks and packages had been dumped from the baggage trucks that drove out ahead of us. I could see a few tents set up, the first rows of black barracks, and beyond them, blurred by sand, rows of barracks that seemed to spread for miles across this plain. People were sitting on cartons or milling around with their backs to the wind, waiting to see which friends or relatives might be on this bus. As we approached, they turned or stood up, and some moved toward us expectantly. But inside the bus, no one stirred. No one waved or spoke. They just stared out the windows, ominously silent. I didn't understand this. Hadn't we finally arrived? Our whole family intact? I opened a window, leaned out, and yelled happily, "Hey! This whole bus is full of Wakatskis!" Outside, the greeters smiled. Inside, there was an explosion of laughter, hysterical, tension-breaking laughter that left my brothers choking and whacking each other across the shoulders. We had pulled up just in time for dinner. The mess halls weren't completed yet. An outdoor chow line snaked around a half-finished building that broke a good part of the wind. They issued us army mess kits, the round metal kind that fold over, and plopped in scoops of canned Vienna sausage, canned string beans, steamed rice that had been cooked too long, and on top of the rice, a serving of canned apricots. The Caucasian servers were thinking that the fruit poured over the rice would make a good dessert. Among the Japanese, of course, rice is never eaten with sweet foods, only with salty or savory foods. Few of us could eat such a mixture. But at this point, no one dared protest. It would have been impolite. I was horrified when I saw the apricot syrup seeping through my little mound of rice. I opened my mouth to complain. My mother jabbed me in the back to keep quiet. We moved on through the line and joined the others squatting in the lee of half-raised walls, dabbing courteously at what was, for almost everyone there, an inedible concoction. After dinner, we were taken to Block 16, a cluster of 15 barracks that had just been finished a day or so earlier, although finished was hardly the word for it. The shacks were built out of one thickness of pine planking covered with tar paper. They sat on concrete footings, with about 2 feet of open space between the floorboards and the ground. Gaps showed between the planks, and as the weeks passed and the green wood dried out, the gaps widened. Knotholes gaped in the uncovered floor. Each barracks was divided into 6 units, 16 by 20 feet. About the size of a living room, with one bare bulb hanging from the ceiling and an oil stove for heat. We were assigned 2 of these for the 12 people in our family group, and our official family number was enlarged by 3 digits, 16 plus the number of this barracks. We were issued steel army cots, 2 brown army blankets each, and some mattress covers, which my brothers stuffed with straw. The first task was to divide up what space we had for sleeping. Bill and Woody contributed a blanket each and partitioned off the first room. One side for Bill and Tommy, one side for Woody and Chizu and their baby girl. Woody also got the stove for heating formulas. The people who had it hardest during the first few months were young couples like these, many of whom had married just before the evacuation began in order not to be separated and sent to different camps. Our 2 rooms were crowded, but at least it was all in the family. My oldest sister and her husband were shoved into one of those 16 by 20-foot compartments with 6 people they had never seen before. 2 other couples, one recently married like themselves, the other with 2 teenage boys. Partitioning off a room like that wasn't easy. It was bitter cold when we arrived, and the wind did not abate. All they had to use for room dividers were those army blankets, 2 of which were barely enough to keep one person warm. They argued over whose blanket should be sacrificed, and later argued about noise at night. The parents wanted their boys asleep by 9 p.m., and they continued arguing over matters like that for 6 months, until my sister and her husband left to harvest sugar beets in Idaho. It was grueling work up there, and wages were pitiful, but when the call came through camp for workers to alleviate the wartime labor shortage, it sounded better than their life at Manzanar. They knew they'd have, if nothing else, a room, perhaps a cabin of their own. That first night in Block 16, the rest of us squeezed into the second room. Granny, Lillian, age 14, Ray, 13, May, 11, Kyo, 10, Mama, and me. I didn't mind this at all at the time. Being youngest meant I got to sleep with Mama. And before we went to bed, I had a great time jumping up and down on the mattress. The boys had stuffed so much straw into hers, we had to flatten it some so we wouldn't slide off. I slept with her every night after that, until Papa came back. Chapter